school during the school closures, and similar types of figures in Bangladesh, with only 14% there, for example, saying that it had any contact with a teacher in the last week. So obviously, lack of connectivity in terms of electricity, Wi-Fi, or the money to afford mobile data are key concerns, but so is the lack of human support. So young people say that even if they could access it, they don't necessarily know how to, and they used to be able to ask questions to teachers, and now that's suddenly absent, and particularly difficult for young people who are the first generation to go to school. And our findings also highlight that rural and poor students are particularly disadvantaged, and particularly young people with disabilities who have additional accessibility challenges. In terms of girls' access to education, because of the gender division of labor in the household, then we're also seeing that girls, even if they did have connectivity, they have very limited time to do that. And we're hearing, particularly for older girls and married girls, that actually during the lockdown, because more people are staying in the house, that their domestic responsibilities have expanded, and they've got very little time for themselves. And then in households where there's only one device, for example, girls repeatedly point out that they have less priority in many cases than their brothers do. In terms then of access to healthcare, which is another big concern, in urban Ethiopia, we're seeing that a good fifth of households are reporting that access to healthcare has been disrupted by COVID-19. And in some of the more rural areas, then this is having serious implications in terms of maternal morbidity and mortality. So a district health worker in Afar, for example, told us that in this evil situation of the COVID-19 pandemic, women are suffering due to childbirth, and in our locality are dying due to excessive bleeding after they give birth because they're not able to get access to institutional support at this time. Similarly, for young people living with HIV, we've heard that they're struggling to get access to necessary medications, and also in particular are lacking the counseling sessions that they usually have to support them in managing their disease. In terms of AIDS and gender-based violence, I think this is also very concerning. When we started doing the telephone interviews, we were concerned that young people would be hesitant to report experiences of violence. But even so, in the survey we did in Ethiopia, 66% of adolescents reported that there'd been increased tensions and stress in the household. And that, from the qualitative interviews, we heard that particularly older brothers and fathers were increasingly using physical violence, particularly because they were spending more time in the home, and also stressed because of the poverty and unemployment that many are experiencing. And in Bangladesh, for example, in the sample that we have with Rohingya girls in the camps in Cox's Bazar, 22% of married girls reported that gender-based violence has become more common. In some contexts, particularly rural settings, we're seeing that child marriage is resurgent. So in Ethiopia, girls are saying that they are finding it very hard to refuse marriage now that they're out of school. So even very young girls of 13 or 14 are being married off in some of the rural communities in which our survey takes place. And even boys who had been in school are saying that now parents are pushing them to get married rather than have them idle, quote unquote, around the house. And it's particularly concerning at the moment because, in a lot of contexts, schools play this protective role, not only in terms of, providing a legitimate reason why girls should, remain unmarried, but also that teachers and school principals are often the first port of call to report impending child marriages. And now that schools are closed and many teachers have left the communities to go back to their hometowns, then this reporting mechanism is not in place. What's also a cross-cutting theme that's very concerning is that anxiety is growing. For example, girls in Ethiopia reported that only 28% of them had interacted with a friend, either in person or online, in the last week. And 49% reported feeling moderately scared of COVID-19. So there's a lot of anxiety and stress. So, for example, an 18-year-old Palestinian girl with a hearing disability in Jordan noted, "I'm alone even though I'm locked down with my family. I'm deaf and no one at home understands sign language. I sketch to keep myself occupied and remember happier days when I could take drawing classes." So, what does all this mean in terms of implications for policy and programming? What can we do to try and tackle what a 17-year-old Syrian girl in our participatory research group in Lebanon described as the black hole that she felt that sort of represents her life at the moment because of the financial and the psychosocial strains that's captured in this quote here. So I think there are 4 key implications for policy and programming that it's really important for national governments, but also international donors and NGOs to really think about. So the first thing I think that's coming across is that most vulnerable adolescents are not being reached by emergency social protection. So it's really critical that we have, a scaling up of cash transfer programs to address economic vulnerability, to tackle the food insecurity, and also ensure that there are hygiene supplies and even enough, cash to cover basic things like menstrual hygiene supplies that many girls are reporting they no longer have access to during the pandemic. Then in terms of returning to school that many governments are contemplating, I think, if we're really not going to see many girls stay out of school, it's going to be critical to be investing in outreach to the most vulnerable, as well as catch-up tutorials so that they can make up for the lost months out of school. And I think this is also a time for investing in scaling up the ability for young people to access education online or distance learning in some way, given that we're likely going to see rolling closures of schools over time before the pandemic runs its course. Then thirdly, it seems really very urgent to resume health and sexual and reproductive health services, especially for pregnant girls and adolescent mothers, as well as those living with HIV. And an area that I think is not getting enough attention is really the need to invest in low-cost, either peer-to-peer or community-based psychosocial support initiatives, given the very high levels of anxiety that I talked about. Then finally, right now, while there's a lot of discussion internationally about the heightened risks of gender-based violence, during the pandemic, many of the reporting mechanisms that were in place prior to the closures are not there. And so there's an urgent need to re-energize those. But also a need to address growing community violence. I think Heba touched on this, and we're certainly seeing that in our survey as well. So violence, not just in the family, but also from police trying to reinforce the COVID prevention measures, but also growing gangs that we're hearing about in Ethiopia, for example. And then finally, I would emphasize, the real importance of reporting channels and support services for girls, and in some cases boys, who are at risk of child marriage. The longer that schools open, the greater risk that we're going to see for vulnerable, particularly rural populations.
Thanks a lot, Nicola, for giving this very urgent picture of how vulnerable youths are affected by the COVID crisis, and where we also can see that what's normally their support have been taken away from them, and the efforts that are taken by governments are not really reaching them in terms of, for example, education, the distance education. Hiba, I would like to give you the opportunity to just give a brief comment on what you have heard about the recommendations. What do you think are the most important efforts?
Yes, the most important efforts. Yes, the most important efforts at the health level, the health programs, is to increase the awareness of the community about the risks of COVID-19. Is to support the community to take the protection measures, for example, to distribute masks, to distribute the disinfection kits, the hygiene kits, because of the poverty and because of a high level of unemployability, the community, they are taking care to provide their basic needs for food and basic needs. And they ignore to buy these the disinfection kits. At the awareness level, at the education level, to improve the online and the remote learning in order to protect the youth and the adolescents not to drop out of schools, especially for the adolescents, because there will be the high level of dropping out of schools for the adolescents, males, and the increasing level for the females, because they are already vulnerable, the female adolescents. And at the economical and the livelihood level is to provide the community, as Nicholas mentioned, the cash assistance, the livelihood, to increase and to support the community in this part, because in order to protect them from being unemployed and to decrease the level of violence among the parents and the households members.
Thanks a lot, Hiba. It's pretty clear that we have to do a lot more to ensure that the vulnerable youth is not left behind. Thanks a lot, Nicola Jones and Hiba Hamis, for coming and sharing findings and recommendations on how we further develop this work. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.